Hey everyone, Eric here again, of course. And in this video, I'm going to talk about the story Vaster Than Empires and More Slow by Ursula K. LeGuin. This is a short story, and it's included in The Wind's 12 Quarters, which is a collection of her short fiction. I really enjoy this story. It's the story of a crew of misfits chosen from several different planets to go explore a new planet. The fascinating twist to this story is that Ursula Le Guin took time dilation into effect when you travel across vast distances of space at very high speeds. Time changes. The way you experience time changes relative to how people on your home planet would experience time. And so the characters in this story, they've volunteered to go on this mission to a new planet where they know they're never going to return to anything like the society that they know they're going to leave everyone behind. This story takes place within the universe that Le Guin created, and I'm going to introduce a term here called world building. This is maybe something you've heard if you're into role-playing games or fantasy as well, and it's something perhaps I could have introduced earlier in the course, but I think now's a good time to talk about it. World building is when a science fiction writer creates the parameters, creates the rules of the world that they are asking the reader to spend some time in, the world that they want the reader to accept. And science fiction writers often create a world and then set several stories within that universe or that world. So Ursula Le Guin does this with something that we call the Hanish Cycle. And the Hanish Cycle says that there was a planet of origin. This planet was called Hain, Hain, and that ancient civilization seeded the rest of the galaxy. They went out and they populated other planets genetically so that other people would develop there. In the Hanish universe, Earth is one of these planets. It's a relatively new addition to the planets that are in league with one another, centered around Hain. And it's not necessarily one of the most important planets. In the Hanish cycle, we are not the origin of humanity. Hain is, and we're just sort of a backwater, Earth is. So in this story, there are characters from various worlds, various cultures, and they all get together on this ship called the Gum, and they're going to explore a new planet, far distant planet, that may have life on it. They are all considered insane by the cultures that they're leaving, because who would leave everything they know and return to something completely different? I mean, they're not necessarily going to die in this version of time relativity, but they're going to return to something that is unrecognizable to them. And so each of these characters has a unique, maybe psychological trait that is a challenge for them. And the main character, Osden, has the most well-described psychological challenge. Osden was born with a form of autism, and through an intensive form of hypothetical technological conditioning, was trained not to have that form of autism, but in the end becomes the very opposite. Rather than being unable to or having difficulty with connecting with other people's feelings, Osden cannot shut out other people's feelings. He's an empath, and their feelings are always coming over him in waves, and he knows how other people feel about him. This is the crew. He's one member of the crew who is going to discover this new planet. They land on the planet and they find that it's a world that looks like it's forested. There's trees all over it, and now they are trying to figure out, is anything conscious here? That sounds really interesting, and it makes us ask ourselves, how do we define consciousness? The answer, of course, is we define consciousness by how closely something resembles ourselves. We take our own physiology, our own anatomy, and we extrapolate from that. The more something is like us, the more likely it is to be conscious. So we can easily recognize consciousness in each other. I say easily now, and I guess suppose some people have not always been able to do that. racism is evidence of the fact that some people are not able to recognize themselves in someone else who is fundamentally just like them. But in the realm of recognizing consciousness, seeing it in other people is pretty easy. When we get to animals, we start to maybe think that things that are more like us are more conscious, right? Like apes, whales, dolphins, really smart things. They tend to be more like us. Dogs, cats, we live with them, we see them all the time, we get to experience their emotions, so they seem like they're probably conscious too. When we get to things like bugs, invertebrates, worms, other animals that are very different from us, that have very different nerve structures, and their physiology has some similarity with us. We're all made out of cells, right? But they are very different in their makeup and structure. We struggle more to recognize if they are conscious or not. And the most interesting example of an invertebrate that we interact with to try to understand our own consciousness are octopus. An octopus can solve problems that your dog can't solve. An octopus only lives for a couple years and has no centralized brain. So intelligence, of course, is different than consciousness. They have different definitions. But what is the difference? If we recognize ourselves as being conscious because we use tools and we solve problems and we feel things in certain situations or appear to feel them, well, an octopus can use tools, an octopus can solve problems, and if you scare an octopus, it is frightened. It tries to get away. We say frightened. We don't know what frightened feels like to it, but if something wants to eat you, you run away. If something wants to eat an octopus, it runs away. The further we move away from ourselves, the harder it is to recognize consciousness. So when the crew of the Gum lands on a planet that looks like it's all plants, they have the task of trying to understand, the environment and see if there's anything conscious living there. There have been some interesting advancements in plant consciousness by real scientists over the years. And one of the things that is fascinating is that when you look at a whole forest, a forest that combines different types of trees, I wrote a story about this, a fictional story about this, not exactly science fiction, but I did a lot of research to write the story. The story is called Ponderosa, and it was in an anthology called Manifest West, if anybody cares to look it up. Got me to look at a lot of research and science about plant consciousness, if that's a thing, and learned that varying trees in a forest are connected through their roots. And there are types of fungus and bacteria that form these connections. The connections are biochemical, like they transmit information to one another through chemical reactions. They're not talking, they're not waving their leaves and looking at each other, but they have chemicals that they release when they are stressed. They have chemicals they release when they have too much water. They have chemicals that they release when, there's a logging operation cutting a whole bunch of them down and they're dying. And these messages are able to be dispersed throughout a forest through the root systems, which are connected through these fungal networks. I'm not saying that plants and trees are conscious in the way that we are. It would be interesting to think about how a plant that lives for 1,000 years or 2,000 years or a day, how those things might experience time differently than we do. And so in this book, in this story, I should say, when the characters encounter the trees, they have a reaction like we probably would, which is, oh, it's just a big forest and there's nothing here thinking. But is that a reasonable reaction for the characters in the story? Is that a reasonable reaction for us? When we go and visit a forest, when we go out in the desert and there's a whole bunch of plants growing near one another, do we know what exactly is going on in that large, complex network? So for your response this week, you can either answer the question, how do we know what consciousness is? How do we define that term? Or the other thing I would be interested to know is, if you chose a character from the story and just talked about how they were essential to the mission and how we are to understand the main theme of the story through that character's point of view. You don't just have to write about Osden, you can write about any of the other characters as well. So choose one of those prompts or come up with something else that you think is really interesting about this story